tira sunarayanti. Waral 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 tira sunarayanti.
Hello, hi, Jeronimo, welcome. Let's start with the origins of ayahuasca. Tell us a little bit the cultural context. How do we think, when it was invented, by who, and what was the initial use of this plant?
Ayahuasca, as we know it today, as it's mostly used in the world, or is the most popular formula, it's actually a preparation. So it's a combination of two plants. This already makes it different from other sort of psychoactive plants of traditional use that people might be more familiar with, like peyote or magic mushrooms or tobacco, in which there are just simply plants that are being applied. Ayahuasca is actually a preparation. Their two plants are cooked together to create this decoction. So because it is a preparation, because there's a formula, we can assume that somebody came up with it. It's very, very likely an indigenous person in the Amazon, or a group of them, or many indigenous people in different groups at the same time. All of these things are possible. We will never know. All we know is that there's a beginning to this formula, and that it started with a small group of people, one or many, and that ever since this happened, and this probably happened hundreds, if not thousands of years ago, ever since this happened, this formula has been expanding, and it's been growing out of its place of origin, wherever it was, somewhere in the Amazon. So it went from this early discoverer or discoverers. We imagine that from there to their family, and then from there to their neighbors, all within the same group, and then from there to other indigenous groups. I mean, we can assume this because we've seen it happen. We know now there's at least, around 70 indigenous groups that use ayahuasca in the Amazon. And then this expansion has continued to happen beyond indigenous groups. Already a few hundred years ago, it went from indigenous groups to sort of urban populations in the jungle, and this was a sort of a mixed blood, a mix of indigenous and colonist, sort of nationals. And from there it expanded to the cities outside of the jungle. From there it expanded to other countries, and from there, more recently, perhaps in the last 20 or 30 years, it has expanded to the rest of the world. Nowadays, you can find ayahuasca sessions, I would say, just about in every country in the world, and in some countries, in the Amazon countries, of course, in the countries of origin, it's quite widespread. Just to give an example, the largest ayahuasca church in Brazil has more than 30,000 members. So we're talking 72 indigenous groups, at least 50 or 60,000 in the Brazilian churches. Tens of thousands of people in the Amazon are consuming, are partaking in ayahuasca. And outside of the Amazon, for example, in Europe, for example, in Spain, where we are right now, I estimate there must be more than 100 guides or facilitators providing this.
So before we dive into the present, I would like to structure this conversation between the past, the present, and the future of ayahuasca. So before we dive into the present, I want to stay a little bit on the historical use. You said hundreds, maybe 1,000 years ago. What do you think was the reason of using this plant? Why the indigenous people started using this plant?
We don't know. There's of course myths and legends, in the cultures and the people that have traditionally used ayahuasca. It tends to feature very prominently on the creation myths, together with other very important plants. So there's for people that are living in the Amazon, some plants are absolutely key to their survival. Among them manioc, for example, which is the staple food. This means that this is also reflected in their creation myth. So that, so very early at the beginning of time, humankind was given manioc, usually by some sort of spirit or mythological creature, so they could thrive. So this gives you an idea of the importance of the plant. In cultures that have traditionally used ayahuasca usually comes pretty close or right next to manioc as something that came at the beginning of time, and this gives sort of an idea of the importance that it has in the culture. In terms of the use, what we see is that as the population and the cultures in the Amazon have changed, because there's been a lot of changes in the last 500 years. Since basically Europeans arrived. So what we can see is that there was, on the sort of the most traditional use of ayahuasca that we know, or what we believe are the survives of the most traditional use, it's a very communal, even one could say political use of ayahuasca. It is consumed in group rituals that involves a series of dances where the most important myths and times of the year and times in the mythological calendar as well were reenacted, recreated, danced. And so very groupal, and it had to do with the connection of the group to the environment, to nature, to the territory, and the alignment of all the social forces, the alignment of the human group to its environment. And this meant being in peace or in right relation with the different spirits that own the animals or the forest and nature. I'm not doing the best job. Anthropologists have written long and wide about this, but I think it's a good enough sort of summary. Then, when colonization happens, there's a sort of devastating ethnocide that happens, because of the plagues, because of the diseases, and because of just cultural destruction that came with missionary work and and sort of colonization in general. And what happens is a lot of these groups become decimated. And then they are, so there's the millions die, and then the survivors are gathered by priests into things called reductions, which are these sort of villages that are built around the church, that usually combine 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 different indigenous groups that were living in the area. What is left of them are now living under, close to the church, and there, as sort of a new sort of culture, even new ethnic identity emerges out of this. Ayahuasca use is continued there, but it changes, and it goes from being, like I said, something very cultural or very political, to, it seems like, something much more fixated on healing, on individual healing. You have people that are severely traumatized, and they have lost their culture. They're losing their culture. They're being colonized. They're being conquered. They've been vanquished. And there, ayahuasca continues to be used in sort of healing rituals that have more to do with individual healing. A group of people get together to heal their traumas. It still ties to the old traditions and the spirit work and all of the sort of indigenous culture aspect, but it's perhaps not so tribal and more spiritual and healing. From there, cities begin to emerge in the jungle. The process takes hundreds of years, and then the mixed population between half colonists, half indigenous people that have indigenous, you could say bloodlines, but no longer recognize an indigenous identity or an ethnic group. They begin to gather in cities, and they begin to practice this sort of folk healing. That has elements also of sort of European or Spanish curanderismo, which are the village, the rural folk healers, bone setters, people working with plants, etc. So here enters a very strong influence of Catholicism, but still maintains a link to the indigenous groups, and the songs very often feature words in the indigenous languages, even though sometimes people don't even understand what they're saying. They feature calls to different things. They feature calls to different groups of plants that are power plants and spirits. So there's a lot of, in this sort of vegetalismo, which is this sort of urban folk healing ayahuasca phenomenon, there's a lot that one recognizes of the original indigenous traditions, but there's also a lot of new stuff. Then there's the phenomenon that happens in Brazil, where a population that is no longer indigenous, but is actually of African origin, that had gone to colonize the jungle and work in the rubber boom. They come in contact with ayahuasca and they develop these sort of syncretic religions that are a mixture of, that contain ayahuasca, but also elements of African traditions and European Christianity. There's 3 of these religions in Brazil. And then from there it would jump, you would say, to the West, and becomes a sort of psychotherapeutic tool. So you can see there's a wide range of uses throughout history.
I heard that some tribes would use it for evil purpose, to send curse to their enemies. You know, they talk about this dart, poisonous dart. Can you comment on that? Is this something you're aware of?
Yes, it's. I think they would not say. It might be that they don't say that it's used for evil purposes, but for self-defense. Right. This part gets, you know. So there's been traditionally among indigenous groups. There's been in the Amazon. There's been peace, and also there's been warfare, and there's also been, you know, periods of peace and periods of warfare. These things that happen between neighbors, you know, we Europeans are also very familiar with this. Americans also had wars with their neighbors. It's just human. In the Amazon sort of traditional view, disease is not the act of sort of the random act of a virus or a bacteria that you just happen to catch because it was, you know, because you touch your face after you touch something infected. But it's actually sort of a voluntary. It comes as some sort of transgression or as the effect of others. So either you broke a rule, you stepped into an area that was tabooed, you ate a food that you couldn't, you took things from a tree or animals from a place of the forest where it couldn't be, and then the owner of the spirits of the forest took revenge on you by making you sick. Or later, as people begin to live closer together and in cities, this became more having to do with your neighbors. Or the people made you sick or took revenge on you because usually in their reading they were jealous. So there's something very different there. Amazonian people believe that jealousy is highly toxic and undesirable. We believe that jealousy it's a byproduct of success, and that that having haters is a sign that you're doing everything right. In the Amazon, they would disagree, and they would say that having haters is what made you sick.
Very good. Thank you very much. Last question regarding the cultural context and the history. How is there a difference between the different area, the different country of the Amazon? Is there a difference between the Peruvian use of ayahuasca compared to the Brazilian, the Colombian, the Ecuadorian?
Yes, of course. There's difference. There's difference from tribe to tribe, and from group to group. There's differences even in the Brazilian churches, which are much more recent. There's difference from church to church. You could say, in that sense, I think it's easier to understand the ayahuasca practices as a sort of art form. So, you know, you have, I don't know, let's pick up something like hip hop, although there's such thing as hip hop, the general sort of art, hip hop, it's very different in New York than in Atlanta. Both things remain hip hop, but there's sort of very local flavor to it. It's part of the art form that it takes different. It's even different from neighborhood to neighborhood, and it's different from rapper to rapper. This is also the case with ayahuasca, except perhaps it's even much more varied and rich than hip hop because it's not been around for 50 years, but for hundreds, if not thousands.
I understand. But just to say a little bit more about, what I hear is that, the Peruvian practice is more in the dark, is more introspective, is more for, and maybe now we're already starting talking about how is it used today, but you always hear the Peruvian ritual is more like, inner journey, whereas like the Brazilian sometimes is more celebratory, is more dancing, is more celebratory. What do you think about that?
I would say, being very sort of making a big generalization, I would say that most of what we understand to be the Peruvian design, it's actually descendant from what I was describing previously as vegetalismo. So a group of people gather around a healer in order to get individual healing. They all do it together, but they gather around one person in order to get individual healing. This happens in the dark, and usually only the healer is singing. It comes directly from sort of this indigenous tradition, the line that I drew before. In what we call the Brazilian design, there's actually a lot of influence from the churches. By this I mean sort of the influence of African spirituality. The main difference, one big difference that one could make between Amazonian shamanism and sort of African spirituality is that in the Amazonian shamanism, one person stands in the center and everybody else is sort of an audience, or they're subjects of the healing, and there's one shaman in the center. In the African spiritual, everybody participates. So, in rituals, so some things like Umbanda or Macumba or Voodoo, it's not just one, it's not the main sort of leader that gets the spirits that come through. Everybody's, not everybody, but a lot of people are being. So the out of this comes a certain way of the Brazilian, quote unquote, modern tradition or design that involves the lights being on and everybody singing as opposed to one person. And then last, you could have, roughly speaking, a sort of Colombian or Yajé culture thing. It is similar to the Brazilian, but to the Peruvian, but I would say that in Colombia, because of the historic situation and because of all the violence that happened, ethnic identity among indigenous groups is much stronger than it is in Peru. So what one finds in Colombia, while it resembles the Peruvian, I would say it has a stronger sort of tribal or ethnic cultural aspect and difference, and in this way it is closer to something that happened one step before vegetalismo. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. This is very useful. And allow me a personal question. So what was your personal story with ayahuasca? How did you discover it? How is your practice evolving? Do you still use it? What's your preference in terms of this thing you describe, a more African participatory versus more Peruvian where the healer does the healing? What's your personal story, if you don't mind sharing?
My own path with ayahuasca has been very long. It started 20 years ago. I approached ayahuasca because of a personal interest in all of these in all of these substances. But even before this, before I discovered sort of shamanic use of plants, I was already into psychedelics and sort of experimentation in a more sort of psychoactive way with my friends and in college. And I think lots of people will have similar experiences. I went to Grateful Dead concerts. I went to raves. I was interested in this because I felt that some of those nights things very special or important things were happening, and I thought that I was curious about this. So I became curious about traditional use, and then I started together with a Canadian collaborator working on a documentary about it, because it's the best way to approach something that you're curious about is to make a documentary about it.
I agree.
or a podcast. It just gives you a fantastic excuse to contact people that you find interesting and you don't know, and ask to sit with them and have a conversation about these topics that are like same way but 20 years ago. So I was on the one hand researching for the documentary and filming, and on the other hand I was participating in all of these things. I was very interested in my own personal process. It's been 20 years now. Thanks to the documentary, I've been able to contact and to be with and to sit with and even to drink ayahuasca with a very broad, varied group of people of the different, many different examples of all the different, 3 designs that I described before. I've been able to experience. I think that there's one part about ayahuasca that is an exploration, and then there's one part about ayahuasca that is a practice. So the more one drinks, the better one gets at it. You can also see it, for example, like if you got into poetry or if you go into film. The more movies you watch, the more you enjoy them, the more you get out of them, the more you understand about the history of filmmaking, and also perhaps the more you develop a certain taste for what is it, the type of films that you really enjoy and you really appreciate, and then that tends to sort of get narrow. No, it happens. Also, you see that people who watch a lot of films, they become sort of picky about what they like and what they don't like. Same thing, people who listen to a lot of music, they become, your jazz fiends. They become kind of very, very particular about what is exactly. I find that it happens the same with ayahuasca. I find that, or at least that was my experience at the beginning. I wanted to see and experience as much as possible, and with time, what I was willing to, the places where I was willing to drink ayahuasca myself, not my interest in the different expressions of ayahuasca remains, but the places where I would sit to drink, which is a different story, where I do my practice, have with time sort of narrowed down to a very particular group. That's it. I mean, I'm a little bit hesitant to go into what group that is. I don't think it's that important. But I think most everybody that has been drinking ayahuasca for some time will resonate with this story. That you get to a point where you narrow, and I think this is also important. In a way, it's like any other. It's like any other work. I think. For example, if you're doing psychotherapeutic work, you tend to have, a psychologist, a therapist, 1, 2, 3 when you start, and at some point you sort of settle down with the person that will become your therapist, and for the long term. And sometimes these relationships are very, very long. They last decades. And it's true that one could try other psychoanalysts, but at the end, there's more. The work that you've done with the person that you chose already weighs heavier than the possibility of finding more interesting or more or better prepared psychoanalysts. So I also sometimes make the example with friends. It's like once you have a friend, which it takes many years to make a real friend. Once you have a real friend, somebody, the idea of trying a different friend, it doesn't make any sense. And it's possible that there will be another person out there that could be a more interesting friend for you, but you already have this friend, and the 10 years you spend with them is what the friendship is. It's not how interesting or original or.
Yeah, this is a very good point. We're gonna maybe explore that a little bit more in depth when we're talking about the current use. But I just want to reiterate that Jeronimo is saying that this is a practice, and some people might go from shaman to shaman, from peak experience to peak experience. But to get the most of it, he recommends to stick with one that you resonate with and doing the work. But in terms of your last question about your personal experience, what would be the couple of things that you credit ayahuasca for having helped you with?
I think in my own life, the effect of ayahuasca has been so broad that it's almost invisible. It's almost invisible because it's everywhere, not because it's so small. It's because it's so big that you can't see it. So it'd be really hard to say. I mean, everything. I have no idea what my life would be like if I hadn't come across it. Not just because of the experiences I had, but because of my work. Because I spent so much time working in this documentary, so much of the travels I made, so much of the friendships I developed, and then eventually, the work that I do now for ICEERS, which is an NGO devoted to these plants. So at the end, my entire life sort of now, of course, I have friends and families, and I have interest outside of ayahuasca, but such a large part of my life already for 20 years I've sort of revolved around it, that it's difficult, it's almost impossible to separate. In that sense, perhaps I would tell a story of a recent experience I had, where I felt, and this has happened sometimes, the people I've heard comment on this, during the night the effects were so strong that I felt that I've been sort of dipped into a bathtub full of it, and there was nothing else running through my veins. I was completely soaked like a sponge. So I mean, I would say this is the degree of to what degree it's sort of been integrated. With that said, for people that are curious, I actually don't drink that much ayahuasca anymore. Maybe 3-4 times a year. It's not sometimes 2 times a year. I don't know. You usually concentrate over a couple of weeks during the year, and then the rest of the time I barely drink. So just to people understand also that it's not that it. Another thing that tends to happen is that the more time goes by, the less you need it.
So let's get into the present situation of ayahuasca. So, who and when exported ayahuasca from the jungle to the West?
It's hard to say. For example, the history of Spain, that is the part that I know best. It seems to arrive, that we know of, around the late 80s to the early 90s. I mean, there's some previous explorers that went pretty deep, but that's when you begin to get the stories. It's usually tied to the ayahuasca churches that are traveling and they are bringing it. This was the point of entry to most, not everyone, but most of the early people. And then this establishes a link. So the churches would pass, for example, like the pass through Ibiza, people would get experience of it, and then this establishes a link, and that means that the next thing that happens is that people go to the Amazon to search for this, and then they enter the culture, and then they visit more, and then there starts to be more visits back. That's sort of how it develops. So through sort of visiting ayahuasca members, also visiting shamans, and then the other way around, and then people visiting the jungle and then bringing it back to their countries of origin. Lately, there is a second sort of thing that happens around sort of certain psychologists, psychotherapists, psychoanalysts interest. There's a second wave there, I would say. But it's been very organic, and it's exactly the same thing as what I describe. I think what happened with the tribes. You get one person, and this person finds it interesting, useful, enriching, and then the people around them have some, perhaps some distrust. What is this? I don't know about this. I've never seen it. This is strange. It tastes awful. Makes you throw up. Then they try it, and then they feel that their lives have been enriched. And from there it jumps to the next person, and then to the next person. So just like it jumped from tribe to tribe, it jumps from person to person. Indeed, it didn't jump from tribe to tribe. It jumped from person to person always. It was just person in other tribes. This phenomenon has never stopped happening since the day it was invented, and it continues to happen.
Yes. And so what do you see in terms of the Western use of ayahuasca? What are the typical misuse? Can you just comment on how the Western shaman or the neo-shaman have been integrating this medicine with the West, and what do you think about it?
So we have a cultural practice that is very ingrained in the culture. So like indigenous people have had a direct relationship for, traditional in these tribes for hundreds, if not thousands of years. The brew, has an absolute key pivotal role in their culture. And there's an entire set of practices, songs, teachings, lessons that are built with it and how to work with it. This is something that is hard for us to, in a way, relate to, because we don't have this many of these things that go back. We have a lot of cultural practices that we're very good at. For example, legal litigation. This is like, highly specialized, very complex. Not everybody can do it. Only a few people in our culture are the experts in this. It is incredibly complex. It takes years of study and mastery to be able to do this. Now, we can imagine that it would not be easier for somebody from outside our culture, for somebody from a very remote village in a very remote culture, to actually get good at legal litigation the way we're good at legal litigation, or the way a person who was born into a family of lawyers would be good at it, and had already been and not only a family of lawyers, a family where your grandfather was a lawyer, and your father was a lawyer, and your great-grandfather was a lawyer, and this is in the bloodline of the family. And this is something you've heard about, right? This is sort of what happens. What happens is that we have highly evolved cultural practices, and I'm being light about it. Like I'm talking about, the sort of energetic, spiritual work that happens with ayahuasca, and comparing it to sort of the intellectual work of litigation. And it's not that. It's much, much more complex. It's not just a set of knowledge. But anyway, let's just imagine, for the metaphor, that this is similar. Now we have people that travel to the Amazon. They become fascinating with this, very complex and very evolved, sort of traditions where, grandfather, great grandfather, the father, the son, everybody has been practicing this, and they want to learn. They want to do it too. So the question is, how much can these people really learn? And are they aware of how much they're learning and how much they're not learning? And and the answer is, of course, they can learn unlimited. First of all, they're not indigenous; they were not born there. They're lacking the cultural context, and very often they're also lacking even the language. Many of these people don't even speak Spanish. Never mind the indigenous language. Just the halfway through language, which is Spanish. But of course, they're going back to their country, and in their country, nobody has ever seen, right? So it might be that. If you were studying litigation, you would not get very far in the country of origin of litigation as a litigator. But if you go back to your country of origin, where nobody has heard of litigation, well, I mean, you might be, the people that knows the most about litigation of the entire neighborhood or your entire city. This is sort of what happens. With that said, there is. People have put tremendous effort, and people have learned a lot, and there's very, very good non-indigenous people that are doing this. I will give perhaps another example. In Spain we have our traditional culture that has flamenco music and bullfighting. This was also passed from father to son and entire generations of, and the sort of the origin and the ties to the gypsy people and gypsy culture and all of this. With all of this being absolutely true, some people have come from Japan and they've moved to Spain in their mid-20s, and they spent 8, 10, 12, 20 years, and they are amazing flamenco musicians, and some of them are even bullfighters. I'm not saying it can't be done. It can be done, and is done often, or relatively often. But it's useful to understand how difficult it is to do it right, because if we don't, I think we risk being deeply disrespectful to the traditions and to the cultures of origin.
So this is very interesting, and so if I may, I just want to add a little bit the difference between a ceremony where the guide or the facilitator serves the medicine and then puts a playlist, and a ceremony where there is a driver, if you want. My personal experience is that when the shaman drinks with you, he goes to the same place, a similar place, and then can take you in this ride. When there is no driver, the bus can be a little bit all over the places. So this is something which is very important in terms of understanding how critical is the experience of the shaman. What about the importance of intention and integration? Can you comment a little bit on these two topics?
On the first part of the question about the guide, I recently heard something that I think is useful as a sort of tool to understand this, and it was about the difference between guiding sessions and sitting or holding space. So one thing it is to share some plant hallucinogen with another person, and sort of sit with them to accompany them through the experience and sort of help out if they have some sort of problem. And that's sort of a lower level in terms of the work that is being done. It's just the work of accompanying and holding. And this is, I think, the work that most of our sort of therapists and a lot of Western people are comfortable doing. That's what they want to do. They want to sit. They want to sit for other people. And then I would say the work that comes from the tradition, sort of shamanic Amazonian stuff, is not sitting, is guiding. So that means that one is not just able to sort of sit and hold the space and accompany the person and help out if there's something wrong, but that one is theoretically able to direct what is happening during the session through the songs, through the energetic work, through shamanic practices, but one is actually sort of conducting, giving shape, modulating the night and the experience of everybody who participates. This is a higher level. This is the higher level. This is I would say, perhaps this is the difference between knowing a lot about music and being able to listen to music and being able to separate, good guitars from a bad guitarist, and being able to play music and be a good guitarist, right? And both persons are engaged with music. Both persons have a deep appreciation for it. Both persons have a deep understanding for it. But one person can go one step higher.
But and what about the intention and the integration?
For the second part, that has to do with the work of the guide. Then comes the work of the participant, because the participant is not a sort of passive subject that is just going to ingest a psychoactive plant in preparation in this case, and then something is going to happen to them. That's not it. This is again, I would say, the difference between I don't know if it's the difference between masturbation and making love. And both things involve sort of same physical mechanisms, but there's much more going on. It's a different type of participation, and some parts are actually not fully under your control when you're making love, and that's what's good about it. So the ayahuasca is going to provide most people, with a very powerful, usually deeply meaningful experience. For some people, it's some of the most powerful, meaningful things that will happen to them in their lives. So can be lovemaking can also be like this. So the question is, how are you going to wrap this experience to maximize this? Again, like in lovemaking, lovemaking can be something completely shallow, and sort of sexual, and two people can use each other to have sex, or a deep contact between two people. And if you're going to have a deep contact, it seems like a lot of other things would have to be right. It had to be the right person. It had to be the right environment. You're not going to. Maybe you can do this in the bathtub of a club, but usually it tends to happen in another environment altogether, with sort of certain preparation, certain things that happen before, certain things that happen during, and certain things that happen after. So when people talk about intention and integration, what they're talking about is what place are you going to give in your life to the very strong experience that you're going to have, so that you not only have a strong experience, but you create a container that makes it as deep, as profound, as good as possible. Now, this has to do with the fact that human beings, we are not just, we're not robots, right? So, for example, if I made you a gift, and I just give it to you, say I'm giving you, I don't know, a watch, and I just give it to you and I throw it on the table, it's not the same that if I take the watch and I make a really nice box and a nice wrapper and very nice paper, and sort of folds and it opens and it has a letter with a beautiful message. The watch is exactly the same. The gift is exactly the same. Theoretically, if we were robots, it would make no difference if I throw the watch down or if I put it in a wrapper. But because we're robots, this wrapper actually makes a big difference for the gift, right? It's not just the gift itself, right? It's not just the watch. It's how it came to you, it's who gave it to you, in what circumstances, what they said. All of this is not the same that I give you a watch, that your father gives you the same watch, but it's a watch that he's had for 40 years. It's the same watch, but it's not the same, right? All of this also applies for ayahuasca. So one needs to wrap the experience, respect it, and put it. The experience is what it is, but there's a lot of work that needs to happen around it to make it really sort of powerful. And this includes, for example, setting up an intention. So thinking about what you want ayahuasca to teach you, to show you, what you want to think about, what you want to work on. So why are you drinking ayahuasca? This seems like, who cares? This is deeply important. And then, just as important, what are you going to do with just happened to you? That's the integration. And I think in our culture, we're very good at having the experience, the watch, and not so good at everything else. We're very good at buying watches, but not so good about making really meaningful gifts.
So I'd love you to talk a little bit more about the integration. I mean, the intention, I think the metaphor of the lovemaking and the present is very self-explanatory. So it has to do with open heart and respect and a truly desire to communicate, to commune with the divine, with other people, with yourself. But in terms of integration, how can we tell our listener a little bit more how to go about it?
In integration has to do with how do you make sense of what happened to you. Because you're going to drink ayahuasca and a number of things are going to happen to you. Some of them are going to be sort of easy to understand. For example, you're going to realize that you should tell such and such person that you're sorry about one time you hurt them, or that, these sort of things, for example, are very frequent. Or you're going to realize that, such and such person was actually very important in your life and you're very grateful and it's been a long time since you thought about them. Or you're going to think about a recent disagreement or argument, or you're going to realize how much you truly love your children, or all of these things. And these things are somewhat easy to interpret. The message is clear. But then sometimes in ayahuasca other things happen that are not so easy to interpret. People have visions, and these visions can get quite elaborate but hard to understand. If people will see a tiger, or people will see a trash can, but people will see a bunch of horses running across a field, and what does this mean? Why did I see that? Some people will recover sometimes memories of things that happened in their childhood. Is this a real memory? Is it not? What does this mean? That's integration. So integration is how do you work with all of the material that emerge during the session in a way that is constructive and meaningful. Because, like I say, sometimes the messages from ayahuasca are pretty obvious and clear and direct, but sometimes they're not. So the danger, if one doesn't do the integration work, is that one remains, it's like having an interesting experience, like seeing a really crazy movie, or like, bumping into the street into an interesting but wacky person who tells you some things about yourself and gives you some strange advice and then walks away. Now this could be a life-changing event, or it could be just something funny that happened to you. It depends on how you work with it. This is, I would say, the other side of the wrapper. Right. I'll give an example. There is a lot of misunderstandings that happen with people, especially at the beginning, in terms of what happens to them meant. For example, people will have a terrible experience sometimes. It's not very common, but it happens. People sometimes they drink ayahuasca and they have a miserable experience. Miserable in there's a million ways in which it can be miserable. It can be very painful. People can be sick. People can have very scary or disagreeable visions. People can have all sorts of really very very difficult time and night, and they're really dying for the experience to be over. And when it's over, they never want to drink ayahuasca again. This, I would say, is a failure in integration. Why? Because if you do proper integration work and you begin to dig with the help of a person, this usually integration means integrator is usually a psychologist or a psychologist that has training in helping people integrate, or a person who's not a psychologist but then that has experience on this. If you begin to dig about the sort of the negative feelings that you were having, or even the negative and scary visions that you were seeing, one after some work will realize that actually these things are not sort of random. They are related to that person's life, to that person's experience, or to that person's situation. So something was being put in front of this person. It was very unpleasant because it was a very unpleasant thing. But that doesn't mean that it was a mistake, something that shouldn't have happened, or that has no meaning. Without integration, usually what happens is the person says, I hated ayahuasca and I never want to drink again. With integration, usually the person comes to realize that what happened to them, it was a sort of pointer, a sort of finger pointing to an area of their life that was troubled and that needed attention. So in that sense, one can think about ayahuasca as a sort of microscope. A microscope makes very small things very big. Now, this is useful because it allows you to discover, for example, the effect of bacteria and virus, which you normally can't see, but they have a big effect. But it also it tends to exaggerate things. So if you look at a flea on the microscope, it looks like a horrible monster. But it's just a flea. It does look like that, but it's just... So ayahuasca in general tends to exaggerate things, the good and the bad. And this is useful because it lets you see small things that you wouldn't normally notice. It is dangerous because you can end up thinking that what you saw as big is actually big in real life.
Yeah, absolutely. That's very clear. I was thinking that, one of my teachers once said that, ayahuasca gives you a glimpse on your subconscious, and the subconscious doesn't speak English or Spanish or Italian. It speaks in shape and color and mood. And so maybe sometimes you need the help of an expert of the psyche. And maybe an expert of the Western psyche would have a better insight in understanding the nature of your subconscious. So that's I was thinking maybe can be an advantage of a neo-shaman or maybe of a collaboration between an indigenous shaman and a psychologist. And I know that there are now centers that are using shaman for the practice and then psychologists for the integration. Very good. So let's attack the third part of this talk about the future of ayahuasca. This is, as we mentioned on the introduction, this is pretty much your career now, to try to figure out a way of integrating this compound. And so why don't you tell us a little bit, I know you have this metaphor of the lighthouse. So this idea that, you want to look maybe 20, 30, 40, 50, 100 years in the future and tell us what would you like to see in terms of ayahuasca in the West?
The work that I've been doing for the past few years at ICEERS revolves around ceremonial plant use, around the future of ceremonial plant use outside of the countries of origin. So that's quite let me slowly unpack that because it's quite a sentence. As I think most of your followers of your podcast will know, we're currently in the midst of what is called a psychedelic renaissance, which basically revolves around the medicalization of certain psychedelic compounds. And MAPS is doing work, and Compass and other places, and it could be that very soon in the future, many of these substances will be prescription drugs that will be prescribed by psychiatrists, administered by by health professionals, and probably, hopefully, covered by insurance, by medical insurance. This is a fantastic development. I applaud it wholeheartedly, but it comes with certain limits. The first limit, of course, is that in order to have a prescription drug, you need to have a diagnosis and an application for it. So in order to get, for example, in the near future, in order to get psilocybin or in order to get MDMA, you need to have PTSD or you need to have depression, and then you can have off-label uses. But basically, doctors deal with diseases. Diseases are diagnosed. Where there's a diagnosis, there's a disease. Where there's a disease, there's a drug that you can use against it. So what we're building is the possibility of legally applying psychedelics for people with different illnesses, different diagnoses. I think this is fantastic, and I applaud it. I am a little bit concerned or worried, or I notice, however, that the vast majority of the use of plant medicines, which is what I know, and the vast majority of people using plant medicines nowadays do not have what would qualify as a medical diagnosis. And maybe they never will. That means that they are automatically ruled out of this system. Right? So what I see, not in the hospitals but in the real world, is that the large majority of people that are using these plants, not just here but also in the traditional world, they had a need for these plants, but it was closer to what it would be called some sort of, sort of life transition or life crisis, but not a medical condition. So I'm interested in keeping the door open for non-medical uses of these plants. I think this is going to be the second wave and the most interesting one after the medical uses. And I'm also interested in the model that comes from indigenous groups, which is not A therapist gives somebody a pill, lays them down on a couch, puts a mask and headphones, and sits with them through the experience, and then after the experience is over, they talk about it. They have a conversation about it. This is the Western model. The traditional model is quite different. It's a group of people get together to take at the same time, while being guided by a person who's a sort of expert in modulating what happens during the experience. And working with this group, most of them don't have a medical condition. They're using this for other things. So I think they're very complementary, these two uses. One is more medical and individual, and the other one is more having to do with personal growth, and tends to happen in groups, in communities of practice, in a group of people that gather around a person who serves. And these people, even they develop relationships there, they become friends. This is not, it's another paradigm, it's another way of thinking of things. This is not, we believe, that cancer is an individual thing. You don't, if you get diagnosed with cancer, you're not gonna, you do, but you don't, it's not part of it that you're gonna spend a lot of time with other cancer patients and you become friends of them and their practice, and yet this is sort of what comes from the traditional way. And I think it's very, very useful. It's something that is more integrated into the society. It's not a medical practice. It has to do with what one Kofan elder told me, how to live. He said ayahuasca teaches, yaje they call it, teaches human beings how to live. This is not medicine. This is life. Part of the work I do is to try to imagine how to live part, and ceremonial part, and group part, and non-medical part of the use of these plants finds a place in our society. I'm very clear of how the medical compounds are going to find a place in our society. I'm not very clear how this other part is going to. And I think it would be sad if it doesn't find a place in our society, because I find it's some of the most powerful and useful and interesting part of these plants. So my work and the work I do revolves around sort of trying to investigate, research, and imagine a future for these plants. So what would need to happen? What would we like this to be like? What would we like the Western neo shamans of the future to be like? And also, what would like in visiting indigenous shamans? What would that look like? Would they need a special license? Would they have to get registered with some health authority? Would it not be a health authority? Is this, would this happen as some sort of university? Would this happen as some sort of there's a lot of we need to imagine, and that's where the lighthouse is. How these things are going to be integrated, because what I've seen when one looks, for example, ayahuasca is one that, like I said, that it expands. It's reached us like it reached all the other. It's been expanding for hundreds of years, and it will continue to expand. And that once it has expanded, it eventually becomes settled in the culture, and it becomes a very important part of the culture. And this you can see in all of the indigenous groups. You can see in the ayahuasca churches, in people that have had hundreds of years relationship with these substances. They take a very important place in the culture and a very useful place. So how is that going to be for us? Because I believe that this will keep expanding, and that tens and hundreds of years from now it will still be in the culture. So how would we like that to be? And that involves a lot of thinking, because not just it presents us with quite an interesting challenge, not just in terms of law and regulatory, but also in cultural, in how we imagine these things, and how so that the work that I do in one part is sort of regulatory science fiction. It has to do with imagining what would need to change in our societies for these things to be approved, and people could use this in a legal and safe way. And then one would think of how to work that backwards. And then the other thing has to do with something that is closer to sort of union making. So what needs to change in the people that are already practicing this in our societies in order to be accepted like another profession. So I look at the way other new professions came into the culture. For example, acupuncturists, which once upon a time were outside of our medical culture and now they're accepted. Or for example, coaches, who also, when they originally appear, it wasn't very clear. Here's a group of people that are doing sort of listening and advising, but they're not psychologists and they're not mental health professionals, yet there's some overlap with the work that mental health professionals do. So how does that work happen that, when coaching was something completely new that a strange group of people were doing and nobody knew how it fit, to the place where we are now, where it's a sort of established profession within our culture. And I'm trying to imagine how this could play out, or how we would like this to play out for people using plants, ceremonially outside of the countries of origin. Whew, I hope that made sense.
Yeah, that makes total sense. And I think that I totally agree that the medicalization is now happening. The next important application will be the art of living, which is also be called the ontological approach. This idea of understanding, our own purpose and mission in life. And so there's going to be a situation where, the typical midlife crisis, where someone is a bit lost in terms of what his mission is and why his marriage is not working and why the kids are angry with them or something. And so the way I see it is that, like the example of the coaching, you can either get a coach, which is going to be a licensed psychotherapist, who can come home with the medicine and do private sittings, or you're going to have maybe local clinics.
Or collaborations between the two. I mean, I think, the ability to guide a session, which involves sometimes things like being able to sing well, and the ability to help people integrate what happened, are two different skill sets. Maybe in the future, one person will be able to do both things. For the present, in our societies outside of the countries of origin, it seems wise to have a collaboration between the people who are skilled at handling the session, handling the night, and the people who are skilled at helping people integrate and helping people prepare afterwards. Now, there's for sure going to be, in the future, some sort of psychedelic clinics, staff with psychiatrists and people, administering these substances for medical uses. I would like to imagine also that there will be something that is more like a retreat center, more of like a place of rest, where people who are undergoing some sort of life crisis, or who need a break, or who are not doing well, or who need to think about stuff or process or whatever, can go, and people who are experts at administering this, usually doing more ceremonial work, people can just take the time there to sort of sort these things out, these things that are not actually medical diagnoses, but are something else, for which actually psychedelics are incredibly useful. I actually question if psychedelics are not more useful for people with not medical diagnosis, and it might be that actually giving, in some cases, psychedelics to people with medical diagnosis is very powerful, but it also can be very dangerous because it's very powerful. So there's a what we do know is that moderately healthy people, mentally healthy without a medical diagnosis, undergoing some sort of personal crisis, generally speaking, greatly benefit from the use of these plants. So I would like to imagine a place, speaking about the future or the lighthouse, a place outside every city in the world where people who are undergoing some sort of life crisis know that they can go and take a few days off and get help with these substances and these plants by people that know how to work with it. This also means, in a sense, that there's a whole other issue there with money and sort of how to make it work economically. That is very important, because what we're talking behind that is access. It could also be that this is some sort of prevention medicine instead of intervention. and that is much worthwhile, much better to take, the psychedelics before you're depressed, and that's where they would help the most, as opposed to once you're depressed, when they can also help a lot, but always, any doctor will tell you, it's much better to prevent than to cure, and most people arrive to the doctor's office too late, when the problems are very advanced, and it's much more difficult. If people had only gone earlier and do their checkups and keep a healthy lifestyle, things would have been, the medical intervention needed, which would have been much smaller, much less intrusive.
Very good. This is very clear. So, what advice do you have for two kind of people? For people that listen to this and are intrigued and want to try this experience, would you still recommend them? I mean, they can't do it legally in Europe. Is there any somewhat legal facility in Europe for Europeans that want to try that, or you recommend to fly to the jungle?
First of all, I wouldn't recommend this to anybody. I think it's a very dangerous thing. The same way that I wouldn't recommend, I think, climbing the Himalaya might be a life-changing experience, but I wouldn't go out telling everybody that they should climb the Himalaya. I absolutely encourage people who are called to climb the Himalaya to try, to thoughtfully prepare and train and research and go for it. But I think, and this is another aspect where I have some issues with the sort of medicalization of psychedelics, because I'm not so sure this is something you can prescribe. In terms of, you can take a person that doesn't know what this experience is and say, as a doctor, I think you should have this experience. This is not like an antibiotic. If things go wrong or the night gets difficult, you're going to get very, very angry with the doctor. So it's very important that you have total buy-in. It's very important that you want to try, that so for example, in the ayahuasca churches, where they have, a lot of experience with this, with sort of what do you do with the neighbors who don't drink ayahuasca. They have a double policy. One is that the temple is open to anybody who wants to come. So, if you would like to, drink ayahuasca in Brazil with one of the ayahuasca churches, you literally just have to show up at the door and say, I would like to participate, and they are within, certain logical constraints, obligated by the doctrine to let you in, to invite you in, and to share with you. On the other hand, it is not allowed to invite your neighbors. So that doesn't mean you cannot tell your neighbors, I drink ayahuasca and it's done me good. You can. What you cannot say is, I drink ayahuasca, it's done me good, and I think you should try it. When you say that, you are overstepping your boundaries. You cannot recommend people a life-changing experience. People have to want to have a life-changing experience. So that's the first step. So, for people who are called to climb the Himalayas, everybody else, don't worry if you're not called for this, if you're scared of it, if it sounds like too much, it's absolutely fine. It's not an obligation. People don't need to do this. It's not, absolutely, the main counterindication for drinking ayahuasca is not wanting to drink ayahuasca. If you don't want to drink ayahuasca, you absolutely shouldn't. Absolutely shouldn't. It's really bad idea to drink ayahuasca when you don't, it's like a kiss or like sex. If you want to be kissed, it's going to be fantastic. If you don't want to be kissed, it's going to be intrusive, disgusting, sloppy. Blech.
But there is also something to be said that you only grow out of your comfort zone. So I'm not encouraging people. I totally agree with Jeronimo that it's an intense experience, and you have to do your research. But I don't know almost anybody who regretted to have drank.
Yeah, but again, but that's because also the people who regret to drink, they disappear and they never drink again.
They never tell anybody.
And they don't tell exactly. So again, that's what I said about calling. I think you can be afraid, you can have doubts, but if you're called to it or not. It's something that you have to check with yourself. It's that simple. It's really that simple. If you're not called to it, you sort of know. And if you're called to it, you sort of know too, even if you have certain misgivings or you're thinking, well, yes, but not yet. Okay, not yet.
If I may, for people that are listening now, this conversation, do you want to do it? You don't want to do it? What I would suggest is watch a bunch of documentary on Mango TV. There is Neurons to Nirvana, There is a new one, Songs That Brings You Home. I'm sorry if I misspelled this title. Shock to Awe. On a drug section, there's a bunch of documentary. And then, Jero, what book would you recommend to someone who prefer to read instead of watch?
All of Jeremy Narby's books are very good and very interesting. His last one is called, I think, Plant Teachers, Ayahuasca, Tobacco, and the Pursuit of Knowledge. It's a very, very interesting. It's a little book. It's not very long, and it's a very, very interesting. And I think there's a lot of future in it. Collaboration between an indigenous shaman, so the indigenous perspective and the Western scientific perspective, and he does a beautiful job putting both forms of knowledge together. That's I think that's a very good starting point.
Very good. This is very, very useful information. Last question. For those that want to help the legalization, what would you recommend? They can donate to ICEers?
Yes, please donate to ICEers. We're a small NGO, like all NGOs. We are always struggling for funds, like all NGOs. We could always do more work if we had more donations. So, if you are listening to this and these plans have been helpful to you in your own life, in your own path, and you would like to give back, or you would like to ensure that, or you would like to help ensure that the promise that these plans hold is sort of upheld and protected, you could, we would gladly take donations to keep doing the work that we're doing.
Yes, it's iceers.org. Also, they have a defense fund to help people with legal cases around the use of this ayahuasca. People can Google Jeronimo Ayahuasca and find a lot of talks and video from different psychedelic conference Jeronimo has been invited to. Is it okay if we share your personal email if someone has a burning desire to reach out to you?
Yes, it's very easy. It's just Jeronimo@iceers.org.
I really want to thank Jeronimo because I asked him to stay within an hour, and I know for him, he's such an intellectual and he wants to really give justice to every topic. So I really violated him a little bit, but I promise we'll have him back to expand on these fascinating topics. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you for having me, Giancarlo. It's been a pleasure.
Koka sunarai sunarayenti. 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 Koka sunarai sunarayenti.